So I'm going to talk about Geobody. For those of you who aren't familiar with the idea of Geobody, as Chris said, drawn up by the Thai writer Thongchai Winachakul. And he defines it, a nation's territory is not simply a sizable piece of the Earth's surface, it's a territoriality. It's a source of pride, loyalty, love, passion, bias, hatred, reason and unreason. It also generates many other conceptions and practices about nationhood as it combines with other elements of nationhood. So other writers have already applied the concept of the Geobody to China. Robert Culp uses it to argue that Chinese school geography and history textbooks in the 1930s, this is, quote, worked together to produce an image of the Chinese nation as a geobody. They formulated an image of China as a cohesive territorial unit with fixed boundaries and unified sovereignty. They sought to naturalize China's territorial unity by projecting it backwards into the deep historical past, and in some cases by associating arbitrary political borders with seemingly natural boundaries, which is what Chris was just talking about. The rhetorical and symbolic construction of China as a bounded and sovereign territory helped to underwrite the perceived need to reclaim territory deemed to have been lost to imperialist powers and to integrate bordering areas of questionable sovereignty into the centralized polity. So that's what Robert Culp says school textbooks in China were trying to do in the 1930s. William Callahan has looked at the ways that cartography became a means of describing China's national humiliation at the hands of imperialist powers, and then a mechanism for mobilizing the population against those powers. Now, these three writers have worked almost entirely on land issues, but I think the similar processes were underway in connection with the South China Sea. And what seems clear to me from looking at some of the sources is that China's maritime geobody, its emotional attachment to the islands in the South China Sea, emerged in a few distinct episodes. So there was an initial burst in 1907 to 1909, initially focused on the island of Pratas and then the Paracels. A second burst in 1933 following France's annexation of 6 of the Spratly Islands, and then the third episode in 1946-7, which Chris has written his excellent paper about. And it's not one single simple process, but several intertwined processes. So there's a reaction to the predations of the imperial powers. There's a disgust at the failure of the Qing imperial authorities to resist those predations. The Qing's attempts to bolster their legitimacy, and then Chinese elites' attempts to integrate themselves with the modern world, which involved changing concepts of what China is and what it means to be Chinese. So 1907. It was an extremely turbulent year in southern China. You have the decaying decades of the Qing, the loss of territory to Japan in 1894-5, and the international invasion to crush the Boxer Rebellion a few years before. And in parallel with the rise of the Republican movement, southern China is in political ferment. A large number of civic organizations emerge to voice popular anger against both the imperial powers and the failure of the Qing, and there were at least 5 nationalist uprisings against the Qing in Guangdong and Guangxi provinces that year. One of the generals most actively involved in putting down these uprisings was a figure called Li Jun, who was then the brigade general in the far east of Guangdong province. For some reason, and I'm still not sure entirely why, in spring of 1907, he decides to visit the island of Pratas, which lies approximately halfway between Hong Kong and Taiwan. It's not clear why. In his own account, which I think was published a year later, but even that I'm not entirely sure when it was published, he says he just heard fishermen in his county say that if you want to get rich, head for the Dongsha, the Pratas, the eastern sand. When he gets there, he discovers the island is already occupied by a Japanese entrepreneur, Nishizawa Yoshiji, and 100 labourers working the guano deposits, digging up bird shit, basically, to sell for fertiliser back home. So the admiral is shocked. Yoshiji tells Li that he had discovered the islands 18 months before, and since it was unoccupied, claimed it for Japan. The admiral then encounters a fisherman, Old Man Yu, who tells him about some other rich islands just 200 li south of Hainan, which Westerners call the Pai La Su. He heads there, according to his account, quotes, because these islands belong to China, although he's never actually heard of them. What he found in the Paracels appears to have led him to then recommend an official expedition to settle the islands to prevent other foreigners occupying them. At the same time, he writes an emotive account of his 1907 voyage, including his confrontation with Yoshiji, which I think is published in Earth Sciences magazine in 1908, although the indexes say that that magazine didn't start publishing until 1910, so I'm still trying to work out when that was actually published. And then Guangdong province establishes a commission for the management of the Paracels sometime in 1908. Now, all this is taking place at a time of growing anger about foreign activities in China. So in 1907, there is anger about planned British anti-piracy patrols on the West River between Hong Kong and Canton, Guangzhou. And the crisis is resolved early in 1908 when the Governor-General of the two provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi appoints the same Admiral Li Jun as the provincial naval commander with a mission to end piracy on the river. And this is seen as a great victory for the nationalist cause. In February and March 1908, 20,000 people took part in protests against Japan's reaction to the seizure by the Chinese authorities of a Japanese freighter. And this led to members of the Self-Government Society, a Canton merchant society, calling for action to recover from the national humiliation of the episode. And this phrase, national humiliation, takes root at this point. There were national humiliation meetings, one attended by thousands and thousands of women, according to local press reports, where they urge everyone to wear a ring engraved with the phrase national humiliation. And a society to commemorate national humiliation is formed in Guangzhou around the same time. So perhaps this is why the Guangdong authorities put such effort into their efforts to claim the paracels. The South China Morning Post of the 16th of March 1909 notes that, quote, the local Chinese mind has been agitated somewhat by the reports from Pratas, and that the Chinese in the South are not taking the matter kindly. And then it says that the governor had actually imposed press censorship on the local papers to stop them making inflammatory comments about the issue. But at the end of March 1908, the Governor-General's expedition goes to the paracels, a sort of reconnaissance thing, and brings back some big turtles, which apparently cause a huge sensation in Hong Kong and southern China. And then this is followed by a very high-ranking delegation indeed, which include the Admiral, the Dao Tai, the Secretary of the province's Finance Department, and the Salt Commissioner. And they have grand plans as to how they're going to develop the paracels and make them kind of a money-making venture for southern China. But the point is, they don't know where they're going to. And when they get there, they have a terrible visit. Their voyage is delayed by typhoons. They only get to spend 2 days in there, and it seems they're utterly disappointed by what they find in the paracels. And a short time after, we hear the only plan for the islands is perhaps it could become a convict colony. So the idea of how they were going to make vast amounts of money out of the paracels disappears. Nonetheless, this is the point at which we see for the first time an act of state sovereignty by part of the Chinese state over the Pratas Islands in June 1909. But there's still anger about Nishizawa on Pratas. He's still mining the guano there. So there's a boycott of Japanese goods organised in southern China. And eventually there are negotiations, and the Guangdong authorities can reach an agreement. They pay Nishizawa 130,000 silver dollars to abandon his workings, and the Japanese government agrees to recognise China's claim to Pratas. So this, on the evidence available, appears to be the first moment that Chinese public opinion takes an interest in the sovereignty of the South China Sea islands. And at this point, the Guangdong administration deploys documents showing that the islands have long been used by Chinese fishermen, even if the Chinese state had never actually heard of them before. Now, what strikes me when you read these articles is how familiar the English language authors expect readers to be with the paracels, because they are people who go backwards and forwards between Hong Kong and Singapore. They've sailed past these islands, they know where they are. They're notorious as a hazard to shipping and as a haven for pirates. And you contrast that with the lack of knowledge in the Chinese sources. That kind of brings, so at the end of the episode really is when Pratas Island is purchased, and there's been this mission to the paracels from the Guangdong authorities, but nothing really much happens after that. There are these grandiose plans to develop the islands, but nothing really happens, at least for nothing, another 20 years or so. 1911, of course, there's the revolution in China. 1912, Sun Yat-sen is kicked out of power by Yuan Shikai and sets up a rival government shortly afterwards in Guangzhou. And from this point on, there are different regimes between what's happening in Beijing or Nanjing and the south. And to kind of cut a long story short, it's only in the 1920s that the French authorities in Annam start, and what would become the Vietnamese authorities start to take an interest in the islands. And Gérard Sasquez has written an excellent paper about how it was actually the Oceanographic Institute and the self-interest of the marine biologists in Indochina, which plays an important role in actually trying to assert a French claim to some of the islands. But it starts that the French start to move in the late 1920s. In response, the Guangdong province puts the Paracels under the administration of Sun Yat-sen University, and they organise a mission there. So it's starting to get a bit more contested in the Paracels in the late 1920s. In an effort to try to regularise the maps of China, the new Chinese government in 1930 passes some regulations to inspect maps to try to regularise them, which is more than regularising maps. It's actually really about defining the country's boundaries on land, but also on water. And at the same time, you've got the Japanese, or shortly after, you have the Japanese invading the northeast, and so things like that, this committee are put on hold. At the same time, the KMT splits, and you have a southern faction that breaks away, and so they're acting autonomously from the government in Nanjing. So, in effect, they are, although nominally, part of the same regime, acting autonomously. And in 1932, there are exchanges between France and China about who owns the Paracels once again. And what happens as a coincidence is that in June 1933, this inspection committee for land and water maps finally starts to meet 2 years after it was officially set up. And they begin the process of actually defining the country's boundaries and trying to regularise the maps. This is a state process. But at the same time, the French are thinking about annexing the Spratly Islands. And as far as I can see, these things are coincidental. One doesn't happen because of the other. Now, the background to the annexation of the Spratlys by France has been examined by a few other authors, but to simplify it, the story is that on the 13th of April 1930, the French warship Malicieuse took possession on behalf of France of Spratly Island and, quote, other islands depending on it, without naming them. But the French authorities failed to formally publicise the annexation, although news was printed in a few newspapers. Then 3 years later, prompted by an inquiry from the British government, France re-annexes Spratly Island plus 5 others by name, and Boinaki, Itu Aba, North Danger Reef, known in French as Les Deux Îles, Titu and Loeta, between the 7th and the 12th of April. News of the annexation is released on Bastille Day, 14th of July 1933, reported in some French newspapers, and a formal announcement is printed in the state's Journal Officiel on the 25th of July. For some reason there's a mistake. They then reprint it the following day on the 26th of July. We can trace the Chinese reaction to the annexation through reports in the Shanghai-based Chinese language newspaper Shenbao and the South China Morning Post in English. And what's important to note is it's a very confused reaction, with significant differences between the central government in Nanjing and the southwestern government in Guangzhou, and between officials and popular organisations. So Shenbao carries the Bastille Day announcement with reports from correspondents in Paris and Manila and London. They note the latitude and longitude of the islands as announced by the French government, and that they're located somewhere between Saigon and the Philippines. But they also point out the presence of Chinese fishermen on the islands. Now, the following day, Shenbao reports that the Chinese Foreign Ministry is trying to find out more about the situation, and reports a couple of days later that the Foreign Ministry has asked the Chinese consulate in Manila to report on the situation. Now, according to American records, the Chinese consul in Manila, Kwong Quan Ling, visits the American Coast and Geodetic Survey Office in Manila on the 26th of July and discovers, with surprise, that the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands are different. The following day, while he's still reporting his report, the Shenbao reports that the Foreign Ministry in China is preparing to protest the French government and has asked the Chinese embassy in France for more information. So it's clear there is confusion about where the islands are that the French have annexed. In an article in the North China Herald, which is the principal English language newspaper in China in this period, it reports that the annexed islands are, quote, known as the Xisha Group, the Paracels, and on the 28th it says the Shenbao's Nanjing correspondent reports that the ROC government suspects that the annexed islands are in the Paracels. They then start printing material from the 1928 university expedition on the Paracels to kind of assert a Chinese claim in effect to the Spratlys. Yeah, they're mixing the two up. But there's clear confusion. But this confusion, at least in the eyes of the central government in Nanjing, is quickly clarified. But by then, there's already been a popular reaction to the failure of the French government, of the Qing government, the Republic government, to respond to the French annexation. There were already protests in the newspapers, complaints, demonstrations from members of the Hainan Society in Beijing, and things like this. So by the 1st of August, so 2 weeks after the announcement, the central government is fairly clear that these islands are the Spratlys and not the Paracels. And to cut a long story short, and I have quite a long story here, it comes down to a meeting of the ROC's military committee on the 1st of September, a secret meeting at which they decide that they have no claim, that China has no claim to the Spratly Islands. And they're agitated about it. They say, we know our fishermen go there, but we have no evidence that we've ever made a claim. And this is quite different from the southwestern authorities, who I think are unaware of this meeting of the military committee and continue to agitate about the fate of the Paracels, and continue to mix the idea that what the French have annexed is in the Paracels, and they continue to be confused about exactly that. So the Southwest Province used this issue as a means to attack the nationalist legitimacy of the government in Nanjing, who have already been accused of being too soft on the Japanese, of selling out the country, and that they are the pure, hardline representatives of proper China. And they use this issue to attack Nanjing. So it's in their interests to keep stoking up the claim, and they deliberately or unwittingly confuse Paracels and Spratlys at this point. And what happens really is that shortly after this, a series of articles are printed in Chinese newspapers trying to explain the history of the South China Sea Islands, not to foreigners, not to sort of assert a claim to the French or the British or the Japanese or anybody, but to their own people. So this is what we talk about when the construction of the Geobody, trying to generate a narrative in which Chinese people can understand that they have always owned these islands and always been the rightful owners, by picking out references going back to 1928, going back to the Admiral's expedition of 1909. And he gives an interview in August 1933 talking about his old voyage, and helps to generate a national narrative, if you like, about the connection between the islands and the mainland. And what's fascinating to me, and I came to this the other way, because I was trying to trace the references which are being used in English now and where those sources and references come from. And it's clear to me that the very first English language writing about the South China Sea disputes only happens in 1975, after the Battle of the Paracels the previous year. And they're written by, in the main, international lawyers who usually have a background in China. So a paper by Hongda Chu and Chunhu Park. Chu was from Taiwan. Another paper by Tao Cheng. He did his LLM at Peking University. And they are using, their original sources are these newspapers and magazines which are published in August, September, October of 1933. And I could list them if you want. But there are about 6 articles which define the Chinese narrative and its connection to the South China Sea Islands, and they are then picked up and quoted and re-quoted for the next 80 or 90 years before they are then, 40 years to 75. They continue to be quoted in Chinese, and they have now formed the foundation of a lot of the English language writing about the South China Sea disputes. And that narrative is the narrative you find in Marwin Samuel's book on the South China Sea disputes. It's the narrative you find in Mark Valencia's writing about the South China Sea disputes. And it all comes back to a few badly informed newspaper articles published in the summer of 1933.